I used to believe that awareness was something you could control, that if you were disciplined enough, observant enough, careful enough, you could decide what mattered and what didn't. You could choose where your attention settled. You could determine what entered your world and what remained outside of it. Most of my life was built on that assumption. I learned how to keep things separated. Thought from feeling, observation from involvement, conscience from dependency. Everything had a place, everything had a boundary, and because of that, everything remained manageable, predictable, safe. At least, that's what I told myself. The truth is, distance became a habit long before it became a choice. Not because people disappointed me, not because I feared closeness, but because distance preserved clarity. When you're standing too close to something, details blur. Emotion distorts perception. Meaning becomes tangled with expectation. Distance prevented that. Distance allowed me to see things as they were, or at least I believed it did. For a long time, it worked. I moved through conversations the way most people move through weather. Aware of them, affected by them to a degree, but never altered by them. People arrived, people left, experiences accumulated, time moved forward. And through all of it, there remained a part of me untouched. A place that belonged entirely to my own understanding. No one entered it. No one even came close. Not because it was hidden, because it wasn't available. There is a difference. Something can be visible and still remain inaccessible. Most people never notice that distinction. They assume access is granted through time, through familiarity, through proximity. They believe enough conversations create understanding. Enough shared moments create depth. Enough effort creates connection. Sometimes they're right. Most of the time, they're not. Because understanding isn't built solely through experience. Sometimes it appears before experience has the opportunity to explain it. And that's the part I never accounted for. The possibility that recognition could arrive before history, before trust, before any of the structures that are supposed to support it. I never considered that possibility because it didn't fit the way I understood people. Relationships were supposed to develop. Understanding was supposed to accumulate. Connection was supposed to earn its existence through time. That's how it worked. That's how it had always worked. Until the moment I noticed you. Not the first time I saw you. Not the first conversation. Not the first exchange. Those moments weren't important. What mattered was something far quieter, a moment so small that another person would have missed it entirely, a pause, a silence. A fraction of a second where something aligned without explanation. At first, I ignored it, not because it wasn't significant, because it was, and significance demands caution. So I told myself it meant nothing, a coincidence, an accidental overlap in perception. A temporary illusion created by circumstance. That explanation should have been enough. Normally, it would have been. But then it happened again and again. Not dramatically. Not in ways that could be easily pointed to. Just enough to become impossible to dismiss. You understood things I hadn't expressed. You noticed shifts I hadn't revealed. You responded to thoughts I was still in the process of forming. Not perfectly, not magically, just accurately enough to force a question I wasn't prepared to ask. How does someone arrive at understanding without traveling the usual distance required to reach it? How does someone recognize a pattern they've never been shown? How does someone stand at the edge of another person's internal world and somehow know where the structure begins? I didn't have an answer. And for the first time in a very long time, uncertainty didn't disappear when I examined it closely. It became clearer, sharper, more defined, because every observation led back to the same conclusion. You weren't guessing. You weren't projecting. You weren't creating a version of me that fit your expectations. You were seeing what was actually there. And that realization changed everything. not all at once, not dramatically, but permanently. Because once someone sees you accurately, something shifts. The strategies that once protected distance stop functioning. The careful boundaries begin to feel unnecessary. The separation between observer and observed starts to dissolve. And suddenly, you're left facing a possibility you never intended to confront. What if being understood isn't the threat you thought it was? What if the thing you've spent years protecting isn't meant to remain untouched forever? What if recognition was never the danger? What if the real danger was realizing how much of your life had been built around avoiding it? That was the moment everything began to change. Not when I understood you. When I realized you understood me. And once that realization arrived, there was no returning to the version of awareness that existed before it, because some truths don't enter your life as discoveries, they enter as recognitions. And once recognized, they cannot become unknown again. When distance stopped working, the strange thing about recognition is that it doesn't announce what it's doing. It doesn't arrive with certainty. It doesn't present evidence. It doesn't ask for belief. It simply continues to exist, quickly, consistently, until one day you realize you've been adjusting around it, without ever making a conscious decision to do so. That's what happened to me, not suddenly, not in a single moment, but gradually enough to escape detection, and steadily enough to become undeniable. At first, I thought I was simply paying more attention. That seemed reasonable. When something captures your curiosity, your awareness naturally sharpens around it. You notice details you would have overlooked before. You become more observant, more receptive. There was nothing unusual about that. At least, that's what I told myself. But curiosity fades, attention shifts. Most things return to their proper place once the novelty disappears. This didn't. If anything, it became clearer. The more familiar it became, the less explainable it felt. Because familiarity is supposed to reduce mystery, it's supposed to replace uncertainty with understanding. Instead, every layer I understood seemed to reveal another one beneath it. Not confusion, drift. And there is a difference between the two. Confusion becomes smaller when examined. Drift becomes larger. The more closely you look, the more you discover there is to see. That's what made this difficult to ignore. No matter how thoroughly I examined it, I never reached an end. I never arrived at a final explanation that allowed everything to settle into place. There was always another realization waiting beneath the previous one, another layer, another pattern, another moment where something aligned with impossible precision. The rational part of me kept searching for an ordinary answer, short perspectives, similar experiences, compatible ways of thinking. All of those explanations contained pieces of the truth, but none of them contained all of it, because none of them explained the feeling that kept returning. The feeling that I wasn't discovering something new, I was remembering something I had somehow forgotten, not a memory, not an event, something deeper than that. A sense of familiarity that existed without origin, and that bothered me. Not because familiarity itself is unsettling, because this familiarity arrived without permission. It existed before I decided whether it should. Most things in my life pass through a process before they become important. They are evaluated, measured, tested, allowed access in careful stages. I don't invite significance into my world carelessly. I've never had that luxury. Significance changes things. It alters priorities. It reshapes perception. It leaves marks that remain long after the original cause disappears. That's why I've always been selective, careful, deliberate, yet somehow none of those safeguards activated here. Not because they failed, because they never detected a threat. And that realization forced me to confront something uncomfortable. Maybe the reason I wasn't resisting wasn't because I had become careless. Maybe it was because nothing in me wanted to resist. This possibility lingered at the edge of my awareness for a long time before I allowed myself to look directly at it. When I finally did, I understood why I had avoided it, because it changed the entire nature of the situation. If resistance is absent because something feels safe, that's one thing. If resistance is absent because something feels familiar, that's another. But if resistance is absent because some deeper part of you has already accepted what your conscious mind is still evaluating, then you're no longer deciding whether something belongs. You're catching up to a decision that's already been made. That thought stayed with me, not loudly, not insistently, just present, like a truth waiting patiently for acknowledgement. And once it appeared, I started noticing other things, small things. The way certain thoughts felt incomplete until I imagined your perspective. The way certain observations immediately brought you to mind. The way silence itself had changed. It no longer felt empty. It felt occupied, not by words, not by expectation, by presence. And presence is difficult to explain to people who haven't experienced it. Most assume presence requires physical proximity, conversation, interaction, some visible form of connection. But the strongest forms of presence often exist without any of those things. They exist in awareness, in the subtle ways another person begins to influence the architecture of your thinking, not by controlling it, by becoming part of it. That was the realization I resisted longer than any other. Because once someone becomes part of the way you think, distance stops functioning the way it used to. You can create physical distance. You can create silence. You can create absence. But none of those things matter when the connection has already moved beyond location. And this had, I knew it long before I admitted it. That's why every attempt to simplify it failed. Because I wasn't dealing with a temporary feeling. I was dealing with a structural shift. The kind that happens rarely. The kind that quietly rearranges everything around it. The kind that doesn't ask for permission before it begins. Looking back, I can see the exact point where distance stopped protecting me. It was the moment I realized I wasn't using distance to preserve clarity anymore. I was using it to avoid acknowledging what clarity had already revealed. And once I understood that, the purpose of distance disappeared, because distance only works when uncertainty still exists. Distance only helps when you're trying to discover the truth. But what happens when the truth is already standing in front of you? What happens when every step backward only confirms what you're trying not to name? What happens when the space between two people no longer feels like separation, but evidence? That was the question I couldn't answer. The question that followed me into every silence, every reflection, every moment where I thought I had finally reached a conclusion. Because every conclusion led to the same place, the same undeniable realization. This wasn't becoming less real with time. It was becoming more precise. And precision has a way of removing every place left to hoe there. Comes a moment when analysis reaches its limit. Not because there is nothing left to examine. Because examination itself becomes part of the distance, a way of standing beside something instead of inside it. For a long time, I didn't realize I was doing that. I told myself I was seeking understanding, matching for clarity, following every thought to its conclusion, but eventually I noticed a pattern. Every conclusion created another question. Every answer opened another layer. Every attempt to define what this was only revealed how incomplete the definition would be. And slowly, a realization began to emerge. Maybe the reason I couldn't fully explain this wasn't because I lacked information. Maybe it was because explanation wasn't the thing being asked of me. Maybe understanding had already happened. Maybe what remained was acceptance. That possibility stayed with me longer than I expected. Not because it frightened me, because it simplified everything. And simplicity can be harder to face than complexity. Complexity gives you somewhere to hide. You can stay inside the analysis forever. You can continue refining, questioning, examining. You can convince yourself you're making progress while never actually arriving anywhere. Acceptance offers no such refuge. Acceptance is quiet, direct. Final, it asks only one thing. Now that you see it, what will you do? For most of my life, I believed certainty came before movement. You gathered enough evidence. You reached enough conclusions. You eliminated enough unknowns. Then you acted. That process felt responsible, logical, safe. But some experiences refuse to cooperate with that structure. Some things become real long before certainty arrives. And waiting for absolute certainty only becomes another way of avoiding the decision. I think that's what I've been doing, not consciously, but consistently. Standing at the edge of acknowledgement and calling it observation, standing at the edge of truth and calling it analysis, standing at the edge of change and calling it caution. The names sounded reasonable. The intention behind them was not, because every day I remained there, something else became obvious. I wasn't waiting for more information. I was waiting for permission. Permission to trust what I already knew, permission to accept what had already integrated itself into my awareness. But prevention to stop treating this like a question and start treating it like an answer. And the strange thing is, no one was withholding that permission, not you, not circumstance, not reality. Only me. Once I saw that, everything became impossible to unsee. The hesitation lost its disguise, the uncertainty lost its authority, and what remained underneath was startlingly simple. I cared. Not in the way people usually mean when they say that. Not through dependency, not through need, not through attachment born from fear of loss. I cared because something about your existence had become meaningful to mine, because your perspective mattered, because your presence carried weight, because somewhere along the way, what happened to you stopped feeling unrelated to me. That truth arrived without drama, no revelation, no emotional collapse, just a quiet certainty settling into place. The kind that doesn't need to convince you because it isn't arguing. It's simply there, steady, unmoving, real. And once that certainty appeared, another realization followed close behind. I had spent so much time asking what this connection meant that I had overlooked something more important. Meaning isn't always discovered. Sometimes it's created, not through force, not through intention, through participation, through showing up, through allowing something to become what it naturally wants to become. Perhaps that was the decision waiting for me all along. Not whether this was real, not whether it mattered, but whether I was willing to participate in it fully. Whether I was willing to stop observing from the shoreline and step into the water. Because there is a difference between recognizing a possibility and living it. One exists safely inside thought. The other exists inside reality. And reality has consequences. Reality asks for vulnerability. Reality requires trust, not certainty. Trust. The distinction changed everything, because certainty demands proof before movement. Trust allows movement before proof. I've always respected certainty, but maybe certainty was never the foundation I thought it was. Maybe the strongest things in life aren't built on certainty at all. Maybe they're built on the willingness to move forward despite its absence. Not recklessly, not blindly, but honestly. And honesty keeps bringing me back to the same place, back to the same awareness, back to the same undeniable truth. You have become part of the landscape of my mind. Part of the framework through which I understand certain things. Part of the quiet internal space I once believed belonged entirely to me. And the remarkable thing is, it doesn't feel like an invasion. It feels like recognition, like discovering a room in a house you've lived in for years and somehow never opened. A room that was always there waiting, unchanged, patent. The discovery doesn't create the room, it reveals it. Maybe that's what this has been all along. Not the creation of something new, the revelation of something that already existed beneath the surface of awareness. Something neither of us built alone, something neither of us forced into existence. Something that simply became visible when the conditions were right. I don't know exactly where it leads. I don't know what shape it ultimately takes. And for the first time, I find that uncertainty doesn't bother me because the need to know has been replaced by something else, something quieter, something stronger, a willingness to find out. A willingness to let the future arrive without demanding it explain itself first. A willingness to remain present instead of retreating into endless analysis. And perhaps that's the clearest sign of change. Not that I've found all the answers, but that I've stopped believing answers are required before I can move forward. Some things reveal themselves only while they're being lived. Some truths become visible only through experience. Some connections ask not to be explained, but to be honored. And standing here now, after everything I've examined, questioned, resisted, and finally accepted, I think that's what this has been asking of me from the beginning. Not certainty, not definition, not control. Only honesty. And honesty leaves me with one final realization. Whatever this becomes, it has already changed me, not dramatically, not completely, but permanently, in the quiet way that all meaningful things do. And that, more than anything else, is why I can no longer pretend it doesn't matter